For this session, I'm going to focus on editing for natural colors. So I've chosen a photo which is taken in relatively low light. There's a fair bit of artificial boosting to the brightness that's been done, which is ISO 720, so reasonably high, getting towards 800, which is usually considered high for daylight. This is shot at golden hour, although the sun has actually set behind the hill, which is why it needed to boost the brightness a fair bit. And so what I'm going to do now is just go through a top to bottom approach of all of the tools available in Lightroom to find a way of getting this image to a point that I think feels natural but somewhat enhanced in terms of the colors that are there naturally. And I'll do that with a file which is it's a 45 megapixel file. I'm guessing it's about between 60 and 70 megabytes, so it's got quite a lot of color information and dynamic range. So very bright to very dark, you should be able to reveal quite a lot of detail with that dynamic range. Looking at it at the moment, what we're seeing is a really basic preview that Lightroom is showing us. Before we hit the develop module, we will only get this washed out kind of version of the image. So I'll go ahead and I'll hit develop up in the top right, and this will then give us yet another preview. This is the profile from the camera as it's been interpreted by Lightroom, and it's nothing like what I really want at the moment. So we're going to think of some ways to bring this towards what we think is a little bit more natural. First thing to note in this image is the white balance. We're looking up at the very top. The white balance is the first thing. Temperature and tint. Usually in warmer scenes, the tint will be further towards the purple end to get the correct white balance, and obviously the temperature will also be further towards the warmer side of things to get the correct white balance. And the best way, if you can, to get a really nice natural white balance is to remember from the scene what was white to your naked eye in the scene. In this case, the dress was white, and in this preview that's been loaded, the dress actually has a blue tint. So it's obviously a fair bit off what we want the white balance to be. So the most useful thing I find for doing white balance is to use the eyedropper tool. Here in the white balance section, I'll grab that and I'll find a point where I think is just a standard white. I'll choose that and click it, and that'll convert it to what Lightroom thinks should make that point that I've chosen white. You can see that it is a lot warmer now, and that part that I've clicked is now close to being white. There's a bit of motion there because she's moving and it's a relatively slow shutter speed, but you can't tell that there's much of a blur there looking at it from far away, and the parts that are meant to have no motion blur, her head and so on, don't have much motion blur. So that's fine. Looking at it closely there, you can see that there is a bit of a grain and noise, which we will have to deal with at some point, and that's there because this was shot at ISO 720, and the part that I zoomed in on was one of the darker parts of the image. The darker parts of the image will always reveal or show the effects of high ISO, being the grain, more than the brighter parts of the image. You could shoot an image with a prominent subject which is bright at a very high ISO, say 1600, but you wouldn't see the grain all that much. You wouldn't see the effect of the ISO because the important parts of the image are bright, and that tends to hide the grain. So next step, looking down this list, since we're doing a top to bottom approach, is having decided whether or not we're happy with the white balance, which I am happy. I'm happy to work with that. That is pretty natural looking to me for a single step so far. Next, we look at exposure, and this is obviously one of the more powerful sliders in Lightroom. If you have an image which has a lot of dynamic range, like this one, the exposure slider can be quite useful. You can bring that up and down, and it'll reveal quite a lot of detail in the sky. You can see if I bring it down a lot there, if you look up at the sky, the edges are much more defined and it's not blown out anymore because we've got a lot of dynamic range to work with. It's gone all the way down 3.2 stops, and there's still good detail there, but we're not exposing for the sky, of course. We're exposing for the model, and I was not using a flash, so there was no way to make the background an even exposure with the subject when you have a bright background if you're not using a flash and you're trying to photograph a dark object in front of that bright background. So we could go through and drop the background exposure a bit while we keep the exposure the same on her. An easy way to do that in Lightroom is to create a mask, but we might do that a little bit later after we've gone through the basic image before doing anything complicated. We'll go through the basic image and have a look at each one of the sliders. Next is contrast. In warm scenes, I do like to increase the contrast quite a lot. I think it gives a nice saturation, and because we're increasing the difference between the bright and dark points, it gives nice edges to the image, and I think I'll take it to about -15 because that keeps it a bit softer. Anything below 0 will keep it a bit softer most of the time, but there is enough contrast there to give some nice definition to the edges. Next, we can play with the highlights to get rid of any really extreme blown out parts of the image. You can see that that's got rid of some parts of the blown out background, and so we can see the clouds a little bit better now. Our model is now a bit underexposed though, so we might have to lift the exposure just slightly to compensate for having taken down the highlights. I do quite often take down the highlights quite a lot in a scene like this because I want to make sure everything is very clear and we don't have any blown out overly bright parts of the image. Next, shadows. This picks up the darkest parts of the image, and I don't like to use shadows that much because if you pull it up too much, it does not look natural at all. That is far more detail in the dark areas than is naturally there to your naked eye. So sometimes you can bring it up just a little bit just in case you think the image is a bit too dark in some dark spots, and you could see more of that when you had your naked eye. In this case, yeah, I don't want to increase it very much. I might leave it at about 30 because I want to make sure this is natural looking. That's the point of the exercise. Next, we've got the whites and the blacks. Both of these do more than just increase the brightness of the whites and blacks. They also tend to affect the saturation quite a lot. If I pull up the whites, you can see that the color saturation in the bright parts of the image changes. In the grass with the flowers, where it is originally a pinkish sort of color, if we pull up the whites, it's changing it to a different, more yellowish orange kind of hue. It's changing the hue and tends to saturate it a bit. And if you look at her skin, it's also adding a more reddy, a more yellowish, very, very slight change, but it's noticeable. So you can pull that up if you like, if you think it works. I don't really want to do it too much. Again, just like the shadows, I might only move it up a bit. I'm going to leave it at 20. Next, for blacks, this does tend to affect the saturation quite a lot. You can see in the background when I'm pulling the blacks down, the greens and yellows in the image are starting to become quite saturated. You can see if I pull it all the way down, that's very, very extreme. You can see that it adds a lot of saturation as well as making it quite dark. So I don't want to use that very much. You might want to use that to increase the definition of the image a little bit. Again, just like contrast, strengthen the edges of the image to give the shapes a more, well, distinct shape, I suppose. It demarcates the portions of the image nicely. But yeah, I don't really want to use it that much, and I'll tell you why later, because we're going to use the levels down here, which are very useful for doing a similar thing. So I'm probably not going to do that much with it. I might take it to -15, leave it at that. Next is the presence. Now we don't really want to touch that too much because these things tend to be more stylistic in how they affect the image. They're some of the more powerful tools in Lightroom. You can see if you pull up the clarity all the way, it gives it a very grungy, punchy kind of look, like it's an Instagram filter, basically. And basically, yeah, you can see the brights get extremely bright, the darks get quite punchily dark, and yeah, it doesn't look natural at all. So I'm going to leave that. I'm going to trust the camera has a sharp enough and clear enough image, just with the information it's got. I don't want to use the clarity too much. At the end, I may use it a little bit, but not much. Dehaze, this is probably one of the most powerful sliders in Lightroom. It also is one of the most destructive when it comes to trying to preserve natural colors, because yes, you can see what's happened there. The saturation has increased to levels which you would never, ever, ever see in real life, really. It's a bit ridiculous. So you really don't want to touch that very much. You might use it again as a stylistic choice, but we're going to leave that alone. And most of the time you'll want to leave that mostly alone. I may use it now just a tiny little bit because this is actually quite a hazy scene. And as the name indicates, obviously it's used to get rid of some of that. So I'll just use it a little bit, but it won't have done much. I'll show you how far we've come with the image so far. Having corrected the white balance and done the standard part of the editing suite involving the brightness and the ways we manipulate the brightness through exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, we've made these differences. And so now we move on to one of the other most powerful tools, but one which I trust to keep the natural colors intact, which is the levels. This is very, very, very useful and a very important one to understand. What you have here is a replication of the histogram that you have up the top, except it shows only the bright, dark continuum, if you will, of the image, as opposed to the brights and darks plus all of the colors. So in this replication of the histogram involving the lights and darks, you can see that the highest part of the graph is around the center of the highest part of the graph is around the center of the x-axis. And that means that we have exposed it very well. Most of the information is in the center of the image, and that's what we want, especially for preserving natural colors. So I'm going to put an anchor point right above the highest part of the image, and then I'm going to hold shift and grab another point and pull that down a little bit, and you'll see that will flex the line. There's a kind of reciprocity in the way that the upper part of the line on the top right hand side of the graph reacts when I pull the left hand side down. So doing that, again, we're manipulating contrast because I'm making the darks darker, and by making the darks darker, we're also making the brights a bit brighter. So it adds to the punch of the image. I'm going to get rid of that point because I'm going to do what I like doing, which is just lift the blacks a little bit at the very end. And then I'll pull it down somewhere in the darker part of the image and make that level with that first point that I picked up. Now, I still think that some parts of the image, particularly around her eyes, just a little bit, and around the edges of her hair are just a bit dark. So I might see what happens lifting the levels a bit. Actually, because that's still remaining quite dark, I'm picking up the highlights quite a lot by doing that. What I might actually do is get rid of that anchor point. I'm going to go a bit further back down the image behind where that peak is and pull it up from there. So we basically brighten some of the slightly darker parts of the midtones in that part of the image. And I think that that's about it. There's not much actually to do there besides reduce that a little bit. Actually, one thing I forgot is the saturation here and the vibrance. I didn't show you that. The Lightroom has interpreted the saturation setting on my camera as being plus 12. I don't really want it to be that saturated, so I'll pull that back a little bit. Probably just a 0. We'll just make it neutral. And I might want to pull the contrast up a little bit to add a slightly more saturation. So, having done that, we now have a reasonably natural looking image. There's not too much to complain about it besides the impact of the high ISO, the grain, which I mentioned at the start. And that's something that we address in the detail tab here. Above the detail tab, we also have the color, HSL/color tab, and that's for doing a lot of different things, changing the hues and saturations and the brightness down here of the colors, the luminance. But because we're trying to keep this natural, we don't want to affect that very much. Sometimes parts of the skin when you're doing portraits seem a little bit oversaturated, so you might want to pull down the oranges just very, very, very slightly, or you might want to pull down the reds to get rid of red spots on some of the red spots, discolorations on people's skins. If they have a very reddish, ruddy skin, you might want to pull that down a little bit. Yellows is something that I tend to get rid of quite often. I don't like having a lot of yellow in my image. It's just a color that I don't really like involving very much. And I tend to get rid of it at least a little bit, which I'll do. I'll just make it -10, but I won't change the luminance or the hue. Next is the color grading. Again, that is a stylistic thing, like the presence tab here. It's a very stylistic thing, so we're going to leave that alone because we're trying to maintain natural colors from the raw file. And as I said just before I backtracked quickly there, we're now having a look at the tab that will address the grain for us. For doing this, you have a spot picker, a space picker up here, which you can just click and drag over to the spot that you want to have a closer look at. For me, it's a face, because that's obviously the most interesting part of the image and the part that we want to do the most detailing work on. You can see that there is quite a lot of grain there, and the sharpening, the radius of the sharpening, all of this, that's all been interpreted from the camera. I've set the camera to a certain sharpening profile, which is pretty high. It's probably about 4/5 of the camera's capacity to sharpen, and Lightroom has interpreted that as being 88 sharpness. You can make it a lot sharper, but it starts to look very strangely grainy if you do that. So may as well leave it around about there. The radius is a number which corresponds to the size of your image in terms of resolution. 2 is the standard size for if you've got a 45 megapixel image, which you'll see is 8256 by 5504 pixels, as indicated in the top left corner there. And you can toggle that on and off and cycle through the information for the file just by hitting I on your keyboard. So where was I? Yeah, doing detailing. Masking gets rid of the impact of the sharpening on the dark parts of the image, because sometimes if you sharpen the dark parts of the image, it just adds to the grain that you can see in those darker spaces. So you might want to pull that up. I find a very useful thing when doing this is to hold down Option if you've got a Mac, Control, I believe, or Command if you've got a PC. And when you do that, it will put a mask over it, and as you drag it, you can see that the white starts to disappear and the black is revealed. The black part is the part that is being affected by the masking, which means that the black part is the part where the impact of the sharpening is being removed. So I might just leave it at about 20 because, yeah, it's okay. The grain isn't too much of an issue in this image. I'll leave it at 30. It's still a bit grainy. You can see that there's it's very hard to see, but there is a bit of color noise in there. So blue, green, yellowish speckles, they're good to get rid of. Usually when you've got a photo shot at about ISO 720, you will have some of that, and you lifting it to about 30 or 35 is a safe place to have the color noise reduction. You can look at the lens corrections if you want. This is something that you have to set up outside in the top menu, in the preferences in the top menu. But yeah, that's something maybe for another time. Down the very, very bottom is another set of very powerful tools. We've got effects here. We can close that up because really not going to use that very much. Transformation, it's for cropping, etc. So now we can decide, do we want to crop it? In this case, I'm not very interested in cropping it. I framed that up just about exactly how I wanted it to, but if I wanted to crop it, a quick way to do it is to press R on your keyboard. That'll bring up your grid. And then up here in the cropping and straightening part, it'll have aspect and angle. That'll tilt the image left to right. And this will change, obviously, the ratio of the image. And for Instagram, if you're shooting a portrait, you want to have it in 4:5 or 8:10, because that is the tallest that Instagram will take an image without it cutting off the top and bottom. So we can hit that and it'll make it a more square. It's gone for 8:10, so the horizontal part is the longer part. I actually want it in a portrait orientation though, so I'm going to hold shift and grab the top corner and just pull it in like that and move it across and frame that up as I like it. Maybe position her head slightly falling away from the center of the image, just because it gives it a nice kind of movement. There we go. And then below that, below the transform tab, we've got the calibration tab. This is really, really useful when you're thinking about how warm the image is as well. The shadows here, you've got the tint for your shadows. In a warmer image, like I mentioned up at the very top with the hue, warmer images tend to have a hue that is towards the magenta, purple end of the spectrum. So sometimes when I try and make the image feel a bit warmer, I lift that just a little bit. Images with more shadows in will be affected more dramatically by doing this. There's a lot of highlights in this as opposed to shadows, so you can play with that relatively flexibly. And having done that, we're just about done. The sharpening has been done. The levels have been done. Yeah, that's everything that I wanted to go through for now. At another point, I'll go through it with some other programs involved, which I think help this image a lot. But for now, that's where we'll leave it. If you do want to have a little tidbit for the end of this tutorial though, the masking in Lightroom is very, very, very good. The artificial intelligence for selecting parts of the image has improved dramatically in the past year. So you can hold Shift W to bring up the masking options, but easier just to find this little circle up here. If you hit that, it'll give you masking options. And these are the really powerful new artificial intelligence masking options that have been introduced recently. Select subject is great. You can hit that and it'll give you an overlay that shows that she has been almost just about perfectly selected out of the background. There's some issues around her fingers where it's not quite right, but you don't really have to worry about that by and large. Now what I like to do is hit invert here, because what I want to do is not actually affect her. I just want to affect her background. So if I hit invert, that will select her background instead. But I want to keep the foreground, this part down the bottom around her feet and the heather, the grass, I want to keep that the same. What I want to change is the bright part of the sky behind her. So if we go up here into Tools and choose Intersect Mask With, Linear Gradient, choose that, and then you pull that down over the mask you've created, like that, and that will now affect her background. And I will just pull the highlights out of her background a little bit, maybe drop the exposure just slightly, and maybe warm it up a bit just to add to the overall warmth of the image. And so it's a relatively naturally colored image. Maybe a bit warmer than is natural, but it's just about there. If you took it down to about there, that's probably more natural, but yeah, you can do that. But I'm actually going to keep it there because I actually quite like the outcome of having used the white balance eyedropper. And I might just see if the contrast does anything interesting one last time. No, I'm pretty happy with that. I'll leave it at -5. And yeah, that's done just about, unless you want to get rid of a tiny bit of saturation. But I might leave that. Clarity, now you can touch the clarity just a little bit if you want. I won't do that very much, maybe +4. And that's just about it for making some natural colors come out of a raw file in Lightroom.